You're listening to episode 24 of the Physical Education Podcast. Today you're going to learn about the victim mentality and its role in sustaining chronic pain, as well as some practical steps to recognize both its obvious and more subtle manifestations. Hi, I'm Pierre Morand, and you're about to learn about the hidden and often misunderstood causes of chronic pain. For 15 years, I suffered with chronic pain with no cause or end in sight. I tried everything I could find, but was often left with unanswered questions and conflicting advice. So I decided to take matters into my own hands and to become a physical therapist. I studied everything I could about pain, about the body, and about health. Along the way, I realized that the solutions to my pain and health issues were within me. I didn't need someone to fix me. I needed to reclaim ownership of my body and fix myself. More importantly, I needed to fix myself while honoring and understanding my body's own wisdom and capacity for self-healing. Since then, I've worked on bringing this knowledge to others in pain, combining pain science, psychology, biomechanics, nutrition, and neurology to provide the light bulb moments and self-awareness to take control. Because eventually most people in pain realize they need to understand the bigger picture of what causes chronic pain. The purpose of this podcast is to help you see and navigate that bigger picture so that you can finally reclaim control of your health and overcome pain once and for all. Hi folks, welcome to today's episode. I'm going to be looking at the topic of victimhood and the victim mentality and their role in sustaining chronic pain. And this can be quite a touchy subject, but I believe it's often necessary to confront if we're truly committed to getting better. So let's start with the definition of the victim mentality. So for the purposes of this episode, I'm referring to the belief that one's pain or their problems are due to factors outside of themselves. So in particular, they are due to something that someone has done or is doing to us. So examples of this are, you might hear someone say, my surgeon botched my surgery, therefore my pain is their fault. Or someone will say, they were driving recklessly and crashed into my car, which is why I got injured in the first place. Or you'll hear a lot, the big pharmaceuticals and modern medicine are just out to make money, and they just want to prescribe you expensive pills and procedures and not look at the root cause of the problem. And someone else might say, I've got bad posture because the chairs in work are terrible and I have to sit at my desk all day. And then your tendencies like you keep looking back on the past and thinking, if only this had happened, then I'd be where I want to be, or then things would have been better. And you believe that the world is set up against you and for you to fail, and you often or always shift the blame away from yourself. Another tendency would be that you complain a lot but don't take action, and perhaps you believe that you couldn't possibly do anything about the actual problem. And some of the more milder examples that I think for the purposes of this episode I'm going to include, but you wouldn't maybe strictly think of them as victim mentality, but I think they fall under that same sort of umbrella, is that the belief that I don't have time to do that, I'm too busy, and so on. All these kinds of excuses that we come up with, and we'll say, well, I can't do this because of that, because of all these external things. So because of beliefs like these, we either don't take full responsibility for our condition, or we completely avoid responsibility for our condition. So we blame others and we feel powerless. So simply put, whether we consciously acknowledge it or not, we feel like victims on some level. So just to frame all of this in the right way, I want to make it clear that this information comes from a place of compassion. It comes from a place of personal experience. It's not about blame. It's not about excusing the wrongdoings of others. It's about reclaiming power over our bodies, our minds, and our actions. Because some of those complaints that I mentioned are legitimate. If someone crashes into you and you were following the rules of the road, then that's their fault. And if a surgeon made a mistake, then that's their fault. And if a pharmaceutical withholds negative research findings and sells harmful drugs, then that's their fault. But there's a distinction between recognizing the wrongdoing of others and blaming them entirely in order to exonerate yourself of blame. And this might sound harsh, but when you were driving and someone else crashed into you, You were the one who decided to go driving. And when the surgeon botched your surgery, you consented to the procedure, and perhaps you got yourself in a position where you needed surgery in the first place. And when the drug companies released a harmful drug, you sought out a drug for your problem. And this is where it gets really tricky and nuanced, and I'm not saying these facts excuse the wrongdoing of others. I'm saying that there's always a chance to reclaim your power in the situation by focusing on your involvement and what you could have done differently. Even if what you did wasn't wrong in the first place, you retain your power in that situation. You're not a victim of things outside of your control. You're still a person who has agency. And I want to stress that these distinctions aren't something that you should focus on immediately. I'm not saying that immediately after someone survives a car crash that you should be probing them about what they could have done differently, or that they accepted the risks of the road when they chose to drive, so they need to accept responsibility. I'm not saying that at all. Of course, I'm not saying that. This shift in perspective is only for when someone's life has been derailed and shaped by an event and they remain stuck. They remain stuck in that story and they refuse to move on, and their life is now dictated by the victimhood that they've adopted. And I imagine that at the time of one of these events, one of these traumatic events, whatever it is, one of the better things to do is actually to express our frustrations and to bluntly blame others for what happened. And you want to let out that frustration and let your body express itself. But as you begin to heal and you begin to move on from what happened, this shift in perspective may help you to move on fully. So it may help you to make sense of what happened and what you can do to prevent it from happening again. So what does all of this have to do with pain? It's relevant to pain because as long as you feel like someone else needs to fix you and that you're powerless in your recovery, you're not going to make meaningful progress, because you're always going to be looking for something outside of yourself to solve the problem. And as I've touched on many times before on this podcast, you're not in pain because you have a deficiency in chiropractic adjustments or acupuncture needles or massages or fancy supplements. You're in pain because, in the simplest terms, you are no longer honoring your body's needs, and perhaps you no longer know how to recognize these needs. You're disconnected from your body, and the solution is to reconnect and to look inwards. It's not to find that next special remedy. The true solution requires an internal focus, and victimhood makes you focus on how others have wronged you or how influences outside of your control are shaping your life, and it prevents you from recognizing your own involvement. And this is one of the tougher ideas to grapple with. It's that perhaps we truly are to blame and we don't want to confront that fact. And I'll use myself as an example of this. Back when I had Lyme's disease, I had Lyme's disease from the age of 9 roughly, but around the age of 10 or 11, my health had been significantly impaired. My ankle was very sore, I lacked fitness, and I'd gained weight. And we were doing some sort of race in school, and I was really, really struggling. And I remember using my ankle as an excuse, knowing full well that the real reason I was struggling was because I lacked the fitness and the preparedness for the race. I used my condition, I used my Lyme's disease, which was out of my control. I understand that. I used that as an excuse for why I was struggling. And this is somewhat of a minor thing, and I don't blame myself for thinking that way at that age, and you shouldn't if you've been in that situation. But it stands out to me as the first notable moment when I sort of lied to myself. I lied to myself and I used my condition as an excuse. And as I began to look back over the years of being in pain, I noticed this trend of blaming my condition for my inability to attain certain goals. I had it all rationalized, and I could explain how the ankle issue, it threw off my biomechanics at a critical time of physical growth and development. It's 10 or 11. That's a really significant time, you could argue, in terms of your physical development. And then the medications I were on, they stressed my internal organs and they affected my breathing, my overall health. And I had all sorts of other various stresses of illness and life around that time that took their toll on my body. So I can make a pretty compelling case about all of this, and I can rationalize how I've gotten to this point and how my pain lasted for so long. And obviously there's value in that. I've talked about that before. There's value in telling your story and just laying it all out, but only as long as I'm not using it and as you're not using it to make excuses for other things. So my pain and my health issues became an excuse for why I couldn't achieve physically demanding things. And this can be really tough because a lot of these issues are legitimate, but it becomes a vicious cycle where the issue is sustained because of the victim mentality. So for example, I could have said that my biomechanics had been altered by those issues 15 years ago, and that's why I was prone to injury, which I think was a reasonably fair point of view. But I can work on my biomechanics. I can solve that issue. So the issue was caused by something out of my control. The Lyme's disease, it's a tick bite. I don't know, especially at that age, and it wasn't a common thing. I don't know what I could have done to avoid it. I don't blame myself for that happening. So that was out of my control. But I can now undo that. But if I stay stuck in that story that all of this was caused by something external and that I'm not going to get anywhere, I'm going to keep living according to that story that keeps me safe from the uncomfortable truth that I'm responsible for perpetuating my pain. And I wasn't responsible for it initially. Like I said, Lyme's disease, as far as I know, it's just a chance occurrence. But now my victim mentality is preventing me from getting better. So it's no longer the case, but that was the case for me. It was preventing me from getting better. So that was my experience with the victim mentality. And I wasn't this kind of woe is me kind of person. I didn't necessarily complain a lot, and I was a relatively happy person, but I had this sort of covert victimhood that was completely rational to me. It's completely, normal, and that was just a part of me. And so these things often present themselves as extremely rational and automatic. But in taking a few moments to reflect, again, to write your story, to look at these things, and to ask yourself a few questions, you begin to see how they are coping mechanisms. These beliefs, these things that you take for granted, they are coping mechanisms for the pain, and they protect you from acknowledging your flaws. Now we can talk about some solutions. So hopefully so far you're still on board and you're beginning to see elements of victimhood and shifting the blame in your own experience of pain. And if you're experiencing a lot of resistance to what I'm saying, this may be a good indication that this actually applies to you. And if you completely disagree with what I'm saying and you're taking offense to it, take a second to consider that this may be your own resistance. It may be your brain sort of throwing you off the scent so that you don't confront the uncomfortable truth that you are partly to blame for your current condition. And if you do all that and you try the exercises that we're going to go through, but you still disagree with this perspective that I'm presenting, please let me know, because I would love to hear any constructive criticisms and opposing views. And maybe we could even do a debate style podcast. But anyway, take note of any resistance, and I totally get that was my experience, and it's likely to be your experience to kind of be like, well, this sounds a bit far-fetched, but take a note of any resistance, take a note of any disgust and shock at what I'm saying, as it can be a sign that this actually applies to you, but that you're currently too uncomfortable to accept it, which is okay, and we can work through that. So as for solutions, much of this process is about awareness. So the simplest solution is that now that you've been exposed to this information, you'll begin to look at things differently. So you'll begin to analyze your behaviors and your beliefs, and as you become more aware of the victim mentality and its minor and major influences in your life, you'll have an opportunity to make different decisions for better outcomes. To help you with that process, I've included some worksheets in the resources section that will help you reflect on the topic, and I'll go through some of those questions now to give you a sense of that process. So one of the first things to try, if you're unsure whether or not you have issues with a victim mentality, is to keep what's called a complaint journal. So you simply document your daily complaints and you identify where you've avoided responsibility. So just these are the questions that you would answer. So what are the things that you talk about that you wish were not so? So you document every frustration you experience as it happens. So you could keep a journal. As it happens, you write it down. And when you have more clarity, perhaps at the end of the day, you go back and you ask yourself where you were avoiding responsibility in that moment. And where are you not being responsible? And what are you not being responsible for? And what would it look like if you did take responsibility in this moment? So like really common examples are perhaps you're late for a meeting and you get stuck in traffic and you're cursing the traffic and you're cursing the person who cut you off, and you would write that down, and then you would go back and explore that and say, well, you know, I was late, and if this meeting was so important, why didn't I make sure that I was mitigating for the fact that traffic might be bad, because it's quite common for traffic to be bad. And you start to pick these things apart, and it can seem a bit trivial, but and again, that's not to say that you shouldn't maybe get annoyed at the guy who cuts you off and that sort of thing, but you're just beginning to recognize those patterns, those tendencies to shift the blame and to not take responsibility for what's happening. And you'll hopefully over time begin to overcome that and live basically a better life where you take more control. So this process of the complaint journal will help you to notice little habits of shifting blame in your day-to-day life. And if you feel you have a good sense of where your victim mentality stems from, consider the following questions. So perhaps you've heard all this and you're thinking, yeah, actually this applies to me. I know specifically what it is. It's this event or it's this tendency. And so you've got a very clear idea. So if you have a very clear idea, these would be the questions that you want to answer, and they're also in the resources. But the first is thinking about the event or events that resulted in this victim mentality. Were there things that you should have done differently? So reflecting on what happened, were there things that you should have or could have done differently? Next is, were there important occurrences that were out of your control or beyond your understanding at that time? This can be particularly relevant to when something happens to you when you're young, when you're not informed, whatever it is. For example, you know, I could look at that with my Lyme's disease. What could I have done differently? There's lots I could have done differently, but I was 9. So maybe I wasn't really in much of a position to do things differently. But just to kind of process through that and to think about that, just to let your body and your mind grow from that. So the next question is, what do you gain from remaining a victim? So what does victimhood protect you from? And this is where it gets tough, you know, because what's that harsh truth? And for me, a lot of these things was the harsh truth of a lack of fitness. You know, I'd always been fit growing up, but then all this medication, all these things I went through took a significant physical toll on me, and I just kind of lived on with that. And sort of confronting the pain, trying to do something about the pain, really highlighted to me how unfit I was, and that really made me feel uncomfortable. And it would be easier to say, well, I've got this condition, there's nothing I can do about it, versus confront the fact that I maybe lacked the fitness or whatever it is. So consider what is the secondary gain. Common one would be you get attention, you get care from people. Perhaps you've been in pain for so long, you've had an issue for so long, that that's the life you know, that's what you're familiar with, and what you gain is familiarity. And what you might the prospect of getting better, as much as that might sound good on paper, is the prospect of your life changing radically, perhaps, and that could be very threatening to you, which is very understandable. So what do you gain from remaining a victim, and what does victimhood protect you from? Tough question, but a very worthwhile question. And then the final question is, where will you be in 1 to 5 years if you do not move past this victim mentality? So in a year's time, are you just going to be exactly in the same position? And that was one thing I kind of had to confront, because I sort of had a number of years there where nothing changed. Like nothing really changed. And I would come, say 5 years. So at one point I would come up to something, I would find some sort of information, and this would appear to be the solution to my problem. I'd be like, okay, I'm going to do this. And then I didn't do it. and then a year later I was still where I was, and then 5 years go by, and I'm thinking, well, if I'd only actually done this when I said I would, then I would have, this wouldn't have taken me 5 years to do. And that's another one that can be tough, is to confront perhaps how much time you've wasted. What I would say is, as these things maybe come up for you, if they do come up for you, is to not give them any power, which can be tough. But try not to give them any power, because one thing helped me a lot was because my pain basically changed the course of my life, the path of my life. I wanted to be a musician. Initially I wanted to be an architect, then I wanted to be a musician, and I was in pain, and I started becoming interested in psychology, in pain, in chronic pain, and all this kind of stuff. And so when I finished school, when I was 18, I was dead set on becoming a professional musician, and that was something I was and am very passionate about. But I've become a physical therapist, completely different route. And that took a long time for that to happen, and there can be a certain amount of discomfort in recognizing how long that took, how much of a roundabout way it took to get me here. I can look at the amount of time I've spent in college and how much of that has been not pointless, but I don't use it now. So the way I think about it is that, well, I have all this knowledge now. I studied multimedia, so I have a multimedia degree, and that is essentially pointless for the job that I do, but I have that knowledge, and it helps me make my website, and it helps me sort of make these videos and podcasts. But it doesn't help with treating people in pain. So I could focus on the fact that was 3 years of my life, or I could say, well, it wasn't the right time, this was my journey, this is the way it was, and now I have these skills, and there's no point making this big thing out of it. So if you feel regret, if you feel anything like that, I would say don't give that any power. Don't dwell on it. Don't give it any meaning, because any meaning it has is what you ascribe to it, and that's really important to understand. Now, for these questions, for this kind of work, you, as always, you need to use your own judgment with this kind of work, because you only want to do it when you're feeling good and resourceful. So you don't want to do this on a bad day when you've had a bad night's sleep and you've argued with your wife or husband. You want to be feeling good. You want to be feeling up to this kind of work, and you want to be kind to yourself. You don't want to place all this arbitrary meaning on these things that have happened. It's happened. It's gone. That's the past. No point making this big thing out of it. But there's value in recognizing it and seeing the patterns. So what I really, really want to stress is that this isn't about blame. I imagine most of the disagreement there will be from people who are saying you're victim blaming, you're all this kind of stuff, which is a very topical issue. But it's really, really not about that. It's about awareness and control over ourselves. It's about retaining our agency, which I think is so important. So hopefully these questions and all this content is giving you some food for thought. Now, if you're serious about delving into this process, download the free worksheets in the resources section and work through those. And I hope you found this information thought-provoking and beneficial. As I said, it can be a tough topic to confront and a tough pill to swallow. It certainly was for me, but I think a lot of this is you just chip away at it over time. And what you need is perhaps someone who you don't know, someone who's separated from you on a screen or through earphones, to tell you something like this, so that there's no personal power to it. It's just information. Maybe we don't know each other, and you can accept this from some random person, and if you disagree with, you can just brush me off as some crazy lunatic on the internet. So sometimes I believe it's better to hear this from some person that you don't really know, some random person, versus hearing it from someone close to you, because that can maybe feel like a betrayal. So if you completely disagree with me, like I said, please let me know. I would really, really love to hear your perspective, and I would encourage you to sit with that feeling of disagreement and see where it's coming from, because perhaps it is shielding you from a harmful realization, which is not to be feared, it's just to be recognized, and it gives you an avenue to go down. So I will leave you with that thought. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Physical Education Podcast. If you're the kind of person who likes to help others, then share this with someone in need. If you found value in the information here, they will too. So please share this in whatever way you can. If you have any questions, you can email me directly at pa@thebackpaincoach.net. I may even use your question for a future podcast episode. If you'd like more information to help you overcome pain, be sure to follow The Back Pain Coach on Instagram, Facebook and YouTube, and to join my newsletter. The major turning points in my own recovery have come from changes in perception and through learning more about myself. I believe that we can help others by sharing information that expands their minds. Finally, I'd greatly appreciate if you could leave a positive review on iTunes or Stitcher so that others may find this information and you can play a positive role in their healing journey. Thanks again for listening.